Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Torah portion is Bahar B'chukotai. We marvel at how Rabbinic Judaism modified, if not totally abrogated, explicit biblical injunctions against selling land in perpetuity and taking interest on loans. Using the Pruzbul and Heter Iska as case studies, we explore the audacity of Rabbinic Judaism. So join us for Prozbul and Iska LLC. Well, welcome, Rabbi, to another exciting week of disruptive Torah on Clubhouse. How have you been?
I've been well, thanks. And this is a great topic. I'm looking forward. Now we have a lunch and learn this week to discussing this topic with you.
So, every week I get complimented from time to time on the titles that I choose. And this week I just thought in terms of legal fictions is what we're really talking about. So an LLC is a limited liability organization, but you kind of get the idea. The Pruzbol and Iska are strange words, and we're going to look at both of these rabbinic loopholes, but they did limit liability, so to speak. So it's not a terrible title. We are in Leviticus 25. And God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I assign you, the land shall observe a Sabbath of God 6 years. You shall sow your land, your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of God. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest." And we have kind of covered this before. It talks about this beautiful idea of the Sabbath that we have every week in years. And the idea is just as you rest on the 7th day, so in the 7th year, your male and female serve slaves, the hired and bound workers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts may all eat of its field. It's a open season. Everybody can go and enjoy the bounty. You shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years give you a total of 49 years. It's kind of similar to what we do between Passover and Shavuot. We count 7 times 7 weeks. So again, a recurring theme. And at that point, you shall sound the horn loud in the 7th month on the 10th day of the month, the Day of Atonement. You shall have the horn sound throughout the land, and you shall hallow the 50th year, and you shall proclaim release, or from the Liberty Bell we'll say freedom. You shall proclaim freedom throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you shall return to your holding, and each of you shall return to your family. So here we have a more interesting nuance of this 7-year cycles. And this year of jubilee, each of you shall return to your holding. When you sell property to your neighbor or buy any from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. In buying from your neighbor, you shall deduct only for the number of years since the Jubilee, and in selling to you, the person shall charge you only for the remaining crop years. The more such years, the higher the price you pay. The fewer such years, the lower the price you will pay. Do not wrong one another, but fear your God, for I am Hashem, I am your God. And then, if that wasn't enough, in verse 24, it goes on to say, "Throughout the land that you hold, you must provide for the redemption of the land. If one of your kin is in straits and has to sell part of a building, the nearest redeemer shall come to redeem what that relative has sold. If any party has no one but to be a redeemer, but prospers and acquires enough to redeem with, the years since its sale shall be computed, the differences shall be refunded to the party to whom it is sold, and the person returns to their holding." And then it says, if your kin being in straits come under your authority and are held to you as a resident, let them live by your side. Do not exact advance or accrued interest, but fear your God. Let your kin live by your side as such. Do not lend your money at advance interest, nor give your food at accrued interest. I am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan to be your God. So it's a whopping 38 verses, and it is filled with pathos about I took you out of Egypt. I am your God. This is clearly something of paramount importance, and it has these two concepts of how we prosper, how we navigate the world of commerce and agriculture. One, that this bias of you shall never lose your property forever. There is this reset button called the Jubilee, to a lesser extent every 7 years. And then the other part of it has to do with lending on interest. It's all about making sure that the disparity between the haves and the have-nots never gets out of check, out of hand. It's absolutely powerful. It's as timely today as it's ever been. What are your thoughts, Rabbi?
That is exactly what it is. I mean, it's the great equalizer, and that is it makes sure that people don't get too wealthy and that people don't get too impoverished. And it's actually, I think it's a brilliant system. Now, it's not practical probably in the modern world because of capitalism, but it's interesting to think of a system that actually worked this way. And it did work this way. Part of it is related to the fact that in the time of the Torah and in the time of the temple, the Jews lived according to tribes. So therefore, basically, land was only transferred between members of the tribe. It's like all the Stearns, all you would do would just sell apartments or houses back and forth. And then at year 50, they'd go back to their original owner. But it's not quite as extreme as it looks, because everything was kind of controlled by the fact that you only were allowed to sell to members of your own tribe.
You know, on the one hand, you could almost say that it's a kind of a pie-in-the-sky paradigm, that it is aspirational. And there are those who argue that, it starts by saying when you come into the land. There are those that say this only works when we truly have all the land, and whether that has ever been or not. But it does get into, it realizes it. In the verses itself, it talks about, well, what's going to happen in real life? What happens if you are buying a piece of property? It's kind of like bonds. You know, you compute the face value of the bond based on when it matures. It gets into all of that, and it says in verse 27, the year since its sale shall be computed, and the difference shall be refunded to the party whom it sold. So it has enough detail to imply that these were actual rules and that they were being used. You know,
right.
I think the big question for me before we get into the weeds is, there are so many people that believe in the Bible, whether Jews or Christians. And many of them are against, if you look at the right, you look at the evangelical community, there seems to be in later years this bias against the welfare state, this bias towards untamed capitalism. And I always wonder, forgetting about how they read the Sermon on the Mount, but how do they read verses like this, which are so clearly believing that the open market is fine? And of course, that's not a word that would be used in the biblical time, but it clearly understands a market of a buyer and a seller and a free valuation. restrictions, but it clearly believes that that type of open market economy has to be modulated. It has to be controlled, as you say, to every so often have a check to do a reset. It's beyond me how they read these verses.
You obviously what you said was right, and you have on the source sheet, which we'll get to, some verses from the prophets, and the prophets are always interesting because it shows you that it really happens. Because they talk about, when they did or did not observe the Shemitah. And the Talmud is filled with these kinds of things. And you also have here the decree of Hillel of Pruzbul, which try to do away with some of the prohibitions of Shemitah. You see that these things were actually practiced, which always makes them good. Sometimes we read about these things and they never really happen. But Shemitah and Yovel clearly happen.
Absolutely. And in addition to kind of putting in the kind of obvious provisions for when you buy a piece of property and there are only a few years left, it also talks about, and don't use this as an excuse not to help somebody out. And where that comes really more even forthright is in Deuteronomy 15:9. Where, as you know, Deuteronomy and many places in the Torah, we get a repetition with different nuance of what we've already read. And in Deuteronomy 15:9, it says, "Be lest, yes, you harbor the base thought. The 7th year, the year of remission is approaching, so that you are mean and give nothing to your needy kin, who will cry out to God against you, and you will incur guilt." So it also understands that making these provisions could end up being counterproductive, that one might use these restrictions to say, screw it. I'm not going to make a loan because it'll be canceled. I'm not going to lend money because I can't do it on interest. That's kind of fascinating too, how much forethought and thought there was even before we leave the biblical text.
Yeah, that's correct. That's absolutely right. I think that's true, and it's furthered by the later text.
So as you referenced, Ezekiel 18:13 says, if you lend at an advance interest, beneshech, the translation here is advance interest. It makes you think, and this is Everett Fox, that we're talking about usury or high mob type interest. But I think that's his read, although it's a fascinating read. I think neshech in and of itself means interest. It says, he shall not live. If he has committed any of these abominations, he shall die. He has forfeited his life. The Hebrew is to'evot ha'elu. We, a few weeks ago, read the part of the Torah that talks about the sexual abominations. It uses this same word. And I would almost argue that while the verses, if you want to talk about same-sex marriage, there is one verse. If you look at the Torah talking about these socio-economic injunctions, it rants in many more times, in many more verses. It uses the same disgust, to'eva, that it uses elsewhere. I think that too is fascinating, but it really talks about you have forfeited your life. We so many times distinguish between ritual law, between religious law, and morals and ethics. You do not get that feeling in these verses. It is an abomination to lend or to take advantage of a poor person and charge them interest.
That's absolutely right. And that is an interesting thing, that morality becomes an abomination, and that's explicit here. Right. And morality means how you treat other people.
Well, absolutely. The word neshech itself comes from the word bite. It almost harbors back to the first bite in the Garden of Eden. Who knows? But it is ribbit is the modern Hebrew way of talking about interest. And we should say before we go into the exceptions and look at how this played out in Jewish tradition and law, we should say that the cornerstone of a Jewish community, I believe, is there are three ingredients to what makes a Jewish community. There's clearly a synagogue. There is a mikveh for purity, and there is a gamach, which is a short for Gemilat Chasadim, which is a free loan society. I think that wherever we're going to track this law going forward with the loopholes that the rabbis made, we have to say that they did a pretty good job with all their loopholes, because the sense of giving free loans became the cornerstone of a Jewish community nonetheless.
I think that that's right. And what you're saying is that that has its source here. I mean, it doesn't need to have its source here, because the fact that free loans is a sense of charity is something that all cultures really share. But what you're saying is that the Torah has that all the way back to the beginning.
So I knew when I picked the subject, that I was going to have an opportunity this week to understand what something called a Pruzbul is. I did not realize, I'll be honest, that it went all the way back to the Mishnah, and it went all the way back to Hillel. If you would have asked me, I would have thought that this is something that developed over time. But for those of you who are listening, you don't get any older in terms of Jewish law than the Mishnah, and certainly in terms of rabbis quoted in the Mishnah, Hillel and Shammai, these were one of their earliest schools. So in the Mishnah in Gittin 4:3, it says, "And Hillel institute a document that prevents the sabbatical year from abrogating an outstanding debt, called a Pruzbul, for the betterment of the world, mipnei tikkun olam." So for all of us there, first I'll start by saying, let's talk about Tikkun Olam. We love to talk about that. It has been used for a spiritual, eschatological, messianic ending of the world. When you have Oleinu L'taken Olam B'malchut Shaddai, we have used it for social and ethics. I think here we are seeing it used in its probably purest sense. Tikkun means to fix something. It is for fixing the world. You could even say fixing maybe a rule from God that wasn't perfect, but certainly it is for the ability for the world to continue. How do you take Tikkun Olam in this regard?
Yeah, so Tikkun Olam is a very interesting phrase. I mean, it's interesting because we use it in the 20th century and then the 21st century, which, let's just say how we use it today. We use it today to show that Jewish religion and Jewish history is a moral tradition. For those people who complain about Judaism, Tikkun Olam, it shows that we're moral. But it's more than that, because Tikkun Olam really means to straighten out. It's the great equalizer. I always think Tikkun Olam means that we want to equalize things. The Gemara says, the Mishnah says that it's a mitzvah to give charity to Jews and to non-Jews, mipnei tikkun olam, because that's just the right way to do things. It's the great equalizer. When it comes to needy people, there's no difference between Jews and no Jews.
But I think in this regard, because this regard is really, we're talking not about things that are quote unquote spiritual and all that. Tikkun Olam really means for the way of the world to me. It means you look out there and you go, this isn't sustainable. I would say the sustainment, if there's a word like that, of the world. And again, 2 weeks ago, when we discussed Rabbi Geoffrey Fox's responsa on lesbian relationships, a lot of it focused on the social mores of our day, or the way the world is working. And I think here we are, basically, let's call a spade a spade. Hillel is either himself or he's quoting a tradition that is in a sense abrogating, in the yeshiva, we would say a beferish pasuk. It's abrogating an obvious, straightforward thing which says, you ring the bell, all the loans are off. And he says that, and we'll get into a second how it works, what the mechanics are, but he is abrogating a biblical injunction because of the way of his world. I mean, you could even say that it was the change of a totally agrarian society to a society where there was more commerce, that it actually was a change in the economics of the world. So I just find that fascinating. The other fascinating thing is Pruzbul is obviously not a Hebrew word. It's a Greek word. And as a result, you would seem to think that maybe it's a concept that was borrowed from somewhere else, or at least somehow the discussions. Professor Saul Lieberman has books written on how much Greek in Jewish Palestine, how much Hellenism in Jewish Palestine. The word seems to mean Pruzbul. A pruz is an enactment, and bul means rich. And I'm just wondering whether this is an enactment, therefore recognizing the need to support the capitalists, to support those who have a higher distribution of wealth, and to get them to lend their money and to buy things. Because if they were only constrained 2 years before the Jubilee, they wouldn't be buying anything. No one would be getting we'd be kind of be like we are in Congress today. Everything would be called to a halt.
Yeah, I mean that's good, and the influence of Greek is obviously so, and I think this is a good example. And the fact that bull means the rich, this was a decree, well, it's a decree against the rich, but it's more complicated. Because what is Pruzbul? Pruzbul says that, the Torah says that all loans are canceled in the sabbatical year. So every seventh year, all loans are canceled. What Pruzbul is worried about is that the Torah actually is already worried about it, is that wealthy people will stop lending their money as we get closer to Shemitah because they're afraid that the loan will be canceled. So what Pruzbul does is it says that the loan is not canceled during the sabbatical year. And therefore, the wealthy will have no excuse. They will have to, they'll have to still lend their money. So it's a protection to allow wealthy people to lend their money.
Yeah, I don't think it's against wealthy people. My read was...
No, it's a protection. It allows them to do the right thing.
Absolutely. And of course, the mechanics are that the rabbi said, well, the loan should be transferred to the Beit Din, to the court. And since the courts are in the public domain, a public institution, they are a corporation, if you will, they are not controlled by these rules that apply to individuals. But it's two things. It's a loophole, but it also takes the spirit of the law. If you recall, I referenced a verse in Deuteronomy that said, beware lest you harbor this base thought and don't give loans. So the Mishnah in Shvi'it literally quotes that verse and says that is the reason behind this. So again, if you think back, and I can't help, I apologize for making parallels to our discussion of 2 weeks ago, where Rabbi Fox would say something along the lines of, you can interpret these verses to value marriage, to value long-term relationships, and to value long-term relationships that procreate. That is a biblical value. And then he transcribes that onto a same-sex marriage where, due to the modern science, you can procreate, you can have a long-term commitment. It's a similar maneuver. And I think that's what if anything, here we are, Madlik Disruptive Torah, that's what I'm trying to show, that it's not as strange or out there as one might think. It goes all the way back to the Mishnah.
That's great. I mean, what you're talking here is about a halachic strategy. And what you're saying is we see all the way back to the Mishnah, this halachic strategy and pulling all the Madlik classes together. That's what Geoffrey Fox does in his tshuva. He uses that very same halachic strategy. That's great.
So the other, we just discussed the Pruzbul. The other now is the Heter Iska. Heter is it's not. It doesn't mean loophole. It means mutar. It means something that is permitted. Iska is a word that has survived into modern Hebrew, and it means business. If you are a businessman, you engaged in business, it's iska. Again, the idea of lending money in a post-agrarian society, I think, it's necessary. I mean, there used to be an amazing organization in Israel called Israel Free Loan. And recently, they've pivoted because they want to support and serve the unbankable, people that are willing to take loans, willing to pay an interest rate, but just can't get that loan. So they can't call themselves the Israel Free Loan Society. They call themselves Ogen, but there is value to giving a loan, even if it's at a competitive interest rate. And I think the rabbis understood that. And so if you go to a bank in Israel, I actually was at the Israel Discount Bank in New York, and I was waiting for them to process my checks. I looked up and I saw framed on the back wall a document called the Heter Iska. And what it does is it permits, and there are a few different ways that this can happen, whether it means that when I give you money, I become almost a partner in the transaction. I'm lending you the money like I would a shovel. You pay me use for using the money, not interest, God forbid. Maybe we do it through an intermediary. There's no forbidden nature to giving an interest-bearing loan to a non-Jew, so we bring a non-Jew into the process. There are multiple ways to do this. They are all clearly in the spirit of the law, only in the sense that they go towards the Torah values giving loans, but they go against the letter of the law, which is it says you shall not collect interest. And I think that is absolutely fascinating.
But I think we need to say one thing, and it's what you started with a couple of minutes ago. Heter Iska developed in the 16th century. Pruzbul goes back to the Mishnah. The idea of Heter Iska, that you can't charge interest, that was kind of more developed when the Jews were in banking or the Jews were lending money to one another. That didn't happen all the way in the Mishnah. But the idea of just straight loans, that actually goes back to the Mishnah. So you talked about how we learn halachic strategies. We also learned about the way Jews did business, that there was a need to support the poor. Lending on interest is more business things. Meaning, if I lend you money so you can invest it in your business, well, that's fair. But I need to get back interest for that because I'm making an investment in your business. So, but that wasn't true in the time of the Mishnah. The Jews weren't so economically sophisticated. So they didn't need that. It was only in later centuries that became an issue.
So my initial response to that is, and obviously I agree with everything that you've just said, is that I would say that the lesson from Pruzbul is the one that's more impactful. And that's what impacted me. I had not realized that it went back all the way to the Mishnah. But I actually think that the Heter Iska is more illuminating, because one could easily say, yes, Hillel could do this, but we can't do it any longer. And here, as you say, and it wasn't in terms of the mores or the need for this, sure, business is important, but let's face it, there are many people that keep our religion and don't work on the Sabbath, and they lose money by not working on the Sabbath. In the early days of America, as a historian of American Jewry, you know this, there were many Jews that used to get fired every Friday and had to apply for a job again on Sunday morning. because they weren't willing to work on the Sabbath. But here's somehow or other, if there's a will, there's a way. The rabbis, not the Mishnaic rabbis, but medieval rabbis, more modern rabbis, found ways to modulate the law so that they could go about their business with a capital B. But it just, again, the argument that I'm making that I think we have to recognize here is, and I'll kind of finish with this, is that you cannot get laws that are said with more passion than the laws of returning, of not selling property in perpetuity and not charging interest than you will find in our Bible, in our Torah. And you will not find more rabbinical activism by way of, in a way, trying to retain the spirit of those laws. The operating concept here is tikkun olam, the idea of the world must continue. We have to address how people are living in our world. They were able to adopt the laws even in the face of all of this passion. And nonetheless, it's all totally acceptable. And I feel it's an amazing model to us when it comes to certain hot button issues that we are navigating and looking at today. And it's not a trivial comparison. I think if you're a student of the Bible and you look at this concept of taking interest from your kin, it is passionate, and it is as passionate as any of the items that we're dealing with today. And that I find totally compelling.
That's a great way to end. Shabbat shalom, everybody. Enjoy your day. We got a bonus to have a lunch and learn, and we look forward to next week. Oh, first of all, chazak v'nitzchazek. We finished the book of Vayikra, and we look forward to beginning the book of Bamidbar with you next week. Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom, and I like the fact that it's the book of Bamidbar. There's no double portion. We have a single portion.
Here we go. We're done with the double portions, correct.
So
be well.
It was a wonderful, as always, Shabbat shalom. I wish you
Shabbat
all
shalom.
well.
Be well.